My remedy has been Christ. 100% saved my life. Literally saved my life. I can't explain it. I ran from it. I was terrified of it until I allowed it.
That was a pretty intense video, wasn't it? What is crazy about it is that Eddie is a DevGru Navy SEAL. First, he started out in the Marines. He did a full tour in the Marines, and then he enlisted in the Navy, worked his way up to be a Navy SEAL, and then ultimately on what we call SEAL Team 6, or the Navy's Special Warfare Development Group, or DevGru. He became literally the tip of the spear, the best of the best. And he's going to be with us next weekend right here at Journey Online. It's going to be awesome. Online or in person, either way, going to be amazing. We'll have 3 services next week at 8:30, 10, and 11:30, online and in person. So I hope you can be a part of it. Then also, he's got a follow-on event that evening. That will only be live at the building at 55 Allen Woods Lane in Three-Way, Tennessee. And you're going to want to be a part of that because it's going to be fantastic. Conversation, ability to ask questions, get them answered, understand and hear about Eddie's journey, and his wife will be with him. That'll be fantastic. So, but Eddie is an elite fighter. Now, I have a high degree of respect and value for anybody who served in literally any capacity in our nation's military, guarded our freedom, the freedom of others. That matters to me. But as each person goes up in their rank or in their training, it just becomes this place where you go, man, that's pretty amazing. He's an elite fighter. He's an elite commando. You know, what's crazy about that is we think about the word elite, and elite is something we use a lot. The NBA and Major League Baseball, NFL, NHL, right? Those are all they're homes to our nation's elite athletes. The Fortune 500 business list is a list of the elite businesses in our world. And of the 195 countries there are in the world, Kenya has had the most elite runners. Because between the 800 meter race all the way to the marathon, they've enjoyed unprecedented success in leading the world in elite runners. Elite is an interesting word. It means this. It means a select group that is superior in terms of ability or qualities to the rest of the group or society. Like Eddie's elite status as a fighter, or someone's elite abilities in the NBA or NFL may not just be their innate qualities. It may be their training, or there's something that's unique about them that raises them to a level of unbelievable ability. Are any of you runners? Have been a runner? Hold your hand up. If you're a runner, put your hand up. Now listen, I know some of you are like, I run some here. But you're a little nervous about raising your hand because you don't want to be called a runner, so wait just a second. If you are a hobby runner, right, you are a walker, a jogger, right, you walk a half a mile or you run a mile a day or whatever it is, put your hand up because you are a runner. For those of us who tried the couch to 5K and never made it off the couch, we think you're a runner. That's me. I think you're a runner. So if you're a runner, put your hand up and let's talk about you for a minute because runners matter. Now, while I got your attention real fast, I want you to know we're hosting a color fun run here at Journey on April 29th. It's right over here at the Middle Fork Bottoms. That's a live event because you can't do a fun run online. But you can come and join us. It'll be a lot of fun. All the information you need is at ourjourney.news. But get those hands up if you're a runner, because if you have run at all, okay, put your hand up. Got your hands up? Ready to go. Okay. So if you have run more than a mile, keep your hand up. Okay, see a few people go, okay, not so much, I don't run the whole mile. If you've ever run a 5K or longer, keep your hands up, okay? Okay, I see a few of you are putting your hands down. I see a few of you haven't run a 5K yet. Maybe if you've run a half marathon, that 13.1-ish miles kind of race, if you've run a half marathon, keep your hand up, or longer, keep your hand up, but if you haven't, put your hand down. See how they're going down? Okay, if you've run a marathon, 26.22 miles on a marathon course, and you've run it in an organized way, keep your hand up. If not, put your hand down. You see how the numbers are going down? Now, if you've run one of our nation's majors, right, our major marathons, I got the list here: Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, or Boston. Keep your hand up. But if you haven't, put your hands down. See how it went down? Only a handful have run those major races. And if you keep pulling it down, thank you, by the way, give it up for these folks. That's a big deal because they ran a long way. And if you don't know this, 26.22 miles, that's a marathon. 26.22 miles. Some of you thought it was 26.2. And you're like, well, that's a lot, right? But it's 26.22 miles. And if you think that 2/100ths of a mile isn't a big deal, I want you to know you're wrong. Because I know full well that if I ran that 105.6 feet that's involved in that last 0.02, if I just ran that 0.02, I'd collapse and die. In fact, I want you to know this is fun because there is an event in our family story that lives on in our stories of contention. Marissa was in high school and she was playing soccer at the time, and she challenged me to run a mile with her. And so I decided I'd run a mile with her. Now, what is contentious is that the rest of the people in my family believe that I took shortcuts and that I didn't do the full mile. And I want you to know something that's very important. They are liars. Because when I collapsed at the end of that race, when I laid on the side of the sidewalk, right, in full view of public with every cell in my body pounding in pain, I guarantee you I ran a full mile. And I think somehow they snuck in 3 extra miles that I didn't know about. Because running is difficult, and to keep running is even more difficult. To run at an elite level is a big deal. In fact, there was an experiment done a few years back where they decided they wanted to find out if a human being could possibly run a full 26.22 mile marathon in under 2 hours. That's quite a feat, to run it in under 2 hours, unseen. And so they kind of set all of the right conditions. They set it in Vienna, Austria, where they could minimize the elevation changes and they could minimize the changes in direction. They could make it as easy to run as possible. They recruited a group of elite runners to run in front of one main person so that they would break the headwind. Then they used a computer image to cast an image onto the ground so that group of elite runners knew exactly where they needed to put their feet to maximize their efforts to make it easy for this man right here, Eliud Kipchoge. And Eliud Kipchoge was the man who ran the marathon, and they had to keep an exact pace to be able to finish at a certain time. And it was an amazing race, literally. He finished it in 1 hour, 59 minutes, and 40 seconds. That's pretty amazing. I would have clapped right there, but that's just me. But here's the deal. When I think about this, that he ran all of that, and it didn't count for a world record because it wasn't an open race. Because he didn't have all of the challenges. He didn't have to break his own headwind. He didn't have to veer off and go get a cup of water. A guy on a motorcycle came by and handed him a cup of water. I mean, there's a lot of things that went in to make that special, so it didn't count. But don't you worry, because Mr. Kipchoge is a boss, right? I mean, he decided it didn't count, so he decided he'd train it on it. He ran the marathon in the very slow time of 2 minutes, 2 hours, 1 minute, and 39 seconds. Now, that's unbelievable, if you ask me, that he ran it and holds the record today for a marathon ran by a human being in an open race of 2 hours, 1 minute, and 39 seconds. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. Got me thinking of a bunch of other runners, right? I was thinking of the major things that have happened, the miles that have been run. The 1 mile record, it was broken in the 50s. By one man who broke the 4-minute mile just by a fraction of a second. He held that for about, maybe a month and a half. Then somebody else broke it. Then in 1999, another man broke that record, and he still holds it today. I mean, to hold any record for a matter of months is something, but to hold it for 20-something years, that matters. They broke records. Reminds me of another very important race. And you may be asking, why are we talking about racing on Sunday? Well, I'll tell you this. We're talking about racing on Easter because of this. The biggest race that has ever happened was the Easter morning 1,000-meter dash. It was about the distance between where the disciples were held up and the place the location of the tomb when they heard that Jesus had resurrected from the dead. You see, when the news of the resurrection broke out, so did a race that would change everything in somebody's life, some people's lives. And I want you to look at what it says. It happened about 30 AD, and it says this: early on that Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. Now, this is where it gets real. If you ever think that the Bible's a little boring, a little odd, watch this. So she ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple. Now, I want to point your references. This is in the book of John. The other disciple is the guy who's writing this. So she says, he came back and found Simon Peter and the other disciple. He talks about himself like he's not there. The other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. Don't you love that? Don't you love it? Like, hey, he found the other disciple, me, the one who Jesus loved. He said, they have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. Peter and the other disciple started out for the tomb. Now, you can see a little bit of like, hey, I'm somebody kind of in this phrasing in John, can't you? Look at what he says in the next verses. He says, they were both running. They were both running. Okay, sorry, I had to do a little Forrest there. But the other disciple outran Peter. You get what it's going on? They were both running, Peter and the other disciple. But the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. You think he's got a little chip on his shoulder, right? He stooped in and looked in and saw the linen wrappings that were lying there, but he didn't go in. And then Simon Peter arrived and went inside. He also noticed that the linen wrappings were lying there, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. Then the disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw, and he believed. You know what's crazy about this story is that we look at this, and these are real people with real feelings and real angst in it. And it's one of the reasons why I believe every single word of the Bible is true, because who tells stories like this? Who tells stories about who showed up there and who showed up second, put their name on it, wrote it from authentic, kind of real feelings and real honest stuff? He gets to this point and he says that this race, the race from my place to the tomb, changed my life. Because he said this: the disciple who reached the tomb first went in, and he saw, and he believed. It changed his life. You see, this story is about a race, but I'm glad that you're here today to hear me say this, because this is important for you, that this story is not about who got to the tomb first. It's about who was already on the move when they got there. This story isn't about how hard you've got to race to get to God. It's that he was already on the move when you got there. Easter is not a story about how much you've got to work or how much of an uphill battle you've got to climb to be able to get to God. It's about God already being on the move in your story before you even knew it. And it's so important that you and I get and understand that this story is so much more, and today is about so much more than you trying to accomplish or get something. It's about something that was already done before you even started moving. In the book of Luke, Jesus tells this story about, he tells actually three stories. We talked about one of them last week. It's a story about a lost sheep and a man who loses one of his sheep and has 99 left, and he goes and chases after it. In the next story, he tells about this woman who lost a coin, one of 10 coins, and she turns the house upside down looking for it. Then the third story he tells is one that probably all of us know. It's the story of the prodigal son. Now, you know the story of the prodigal son, not because you're a Bible scholar, but because it's a pretty common story to know. It's one that's kind of written into the fabric of our country, of our normal understanding of our culture. And the story of the prodigal son is one that's familiar with us. You might remember it. We know that it's a story of a young man who goes to his dad, and he says this to dad. He says, I want my share of your estate before you die. This is basically just him saying to dad, I don't want to wait for you to die for it to benefit me. I really don't care if you die now. I want what's coming to me. Now, the people who heard this story would have literally gasped to see a young man treat his dad with that kind of disdain and disrespect. They would have drawn a deep breath and gone, oh no, he did not say that, right? Oh no, you didn't, right? Like it would have been a moment where he thought about it, just like we would have. If our son or daughter came to us and said, I wish you were dead and I just had what I had, it would deeply hurt us and it would offend us to even consider him asking for his inheritance now. The second half of that verse draws our attention to this. The second gasp in this, the father agreed to the conditions. That would have been a crazy story. To have a young man say those things to his dad would have been crazy, but to have his father agree to do that would have been even more ridiculous. I mean, I can't imagine how the crowd of people that were listening to Jesus would have heard that moment. They would have gasped and not, there's no way. But the story isn't over there. It doesn't end with just him wanting his dad to die and wanting his dad to do his thing and get all of his stuff. It says in third part, after a few days later, the younger son packed up all his belongings and he moved to, it says, a distant land. You know, that's probably kind of insider language. It doesn't make a distance to us. We say, oh, a distant land, that just means a far away place. But the hearers that day, the people in that crowd would have heard him be disrespectful to his dad. They would have heard his dad, agree to these ridiculous terms of giving his inheritance before he dies. And then they would have heard this distant land and said, not only is he walking away from his dad, he's walking away from his heritage, his people. What a distant land would have meant to them is that he had chosen to go away to a place outside of Israel, that he was leaving his father, his family. He was leaving his heritage and his people. He was leaving all these things. These people would have completely written him off. He was none to be heard of again. You know the story, how it goes. He goes off to a faraway land and he's got money, right? He thinks he's got it all together. He thinks he's got it all dialed in. And he's spending. And as long as he's spending and got resources, he's got friends that hang around him. But when the resources run out, so do the friends. When the resources run out, so does all the fun. So does the having it all together. So does the being able to eat and sleep inside. And he gets to a place where he has literally nothing. And this story unfolds to these people. And they hear about this young man who's destitute, probably saying a lot like what you and I would say. Serves him right, doesn't it? That's what you get. That's what you get when you say those things to your dad. It's what you get when you tell your dad you want him to die. It's what you get when you hog for yourself and you live a selfish life. That's what you get, son. When you walk away from your people and your heritage and all the people who would care about and protect you, you get unprotected and you are out on your own. That's what you get. He gets to a place where these people who've written him off listen closely because he's homeless and he doesn't know what to do, so he rents himself out to a farmer. And the farmer lets him clean the stalls where the pigs eat. Now, you thought the gasps were loud a minute ago. When he talked that way to his dad, when he asked for his inheritance, when he walked away from his people. But the gasp would have been unbelievable because what he was doing, touching pigs, was an unclean act. They've heard the disdain in his voice, the disrespect for his father, the distancing of himself from his people, and now the unclean act of touching swine. These people would have written him off, never to be considered again. But the truth is that this story has a turning point. Now, I always used to think that the story turned here. I thought that the turning point of the story is when he finally came to his senses. Because I look at the story from my perspective, and that's probably where you do it. Maybe you've been in that place in your life where you've lived one way and kind of done your own thing, and then you come to your senses. There was a moment or a circumstance that kind of pushed you over the edge, and you're like, this is dumb. Why am I doing it this way? And it caused you to change things. I used to think that the story turned here, that the young man came to his senses, and he said to himself, at home, even the hired servants have enough to spare. And here I am dying of hunger. I'll go home to my father and say, Father, I've sinned against you and heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant. I used to think that the story hinged here, that it all story that hinged when he got to the bottom, rock bottom, and he decided a different way was a better way. But I got to be honest with you, I don't think it hinges here. Because I don't think the story is really about the prodigal son. I think the story is really about the father. And if you think about it, what he says here, he says, my father, I'll go home and I'll say to my father, Father, I've sinned against you in heaven. You know what's crazy about this? Is this phrase, I've sinned against heaven and against you, is the same phrase that Pharaoh used. It's the same phrase that Pharaoh used when Pharaoh felt the full pressure of the plagues on top of him. And he went to God. He said, God, I must have done something wrong. I must have done something to offend you. Please take all of this off me. That's exactly the same heart that he has here. He says, I'm no longer worthy of being called your son. It's a fake contrition. Look what he says. Please take me on as a hired servant. The boy still presumes to dictate to his father the terms of his return. He says, here's what you're going to do, God. Now, when I come back, you're going to take me on as I'll take the basement level. I'll take this. You know what? I deserve something, right? This young man says to his father, take me on as one of your servants. He still presumes to tell his father what to do, just like he did when he left. I don't think he's repentant here. But then the story does turn. It has a pretty dramatic turn, and one that we miss a lot. Look at what he says. So when he returned home, and while he came to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming, and filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son and embraced him and kissed him. This is the race of a lifetime here. The greatest race of all in all of history is not about a race or a prize, or it's not about pride or a time. It's not about any of those things. This race, the greatest race of all times, is when the father runs to the son and embraces him and kisses him. See, the turning point of the story wasn't when the boy came to his senses and decided to prepare Pharaoh's speech for him. The turning point of the story is while he was still a long way off, the father ran to him. Now, I know what's going on in your head. You probably have a picture a lot like the one that I have swimming around in my head. What's your picture look like? Does it look like the father sitting on a porch, on a long driveway, maybe a gravel driveway, and maybe like a gate out there toward the street? And while he was still a long way off, the son turns the corner, and dad puts down his mug of coffee and runs to his son because he's happy. I know that's your picture, probably, because it's my picture. It's a very Western way to see this. But what we would have missed, the substantial thing that we would miss in this story, is that there's a whole other thing that's going on between the boy coming to his senses and the father running to his son. What those hearers would have heard, what those crowd of people joined around Jesus would have gasped at all of the things that they had heard up to this moment, but they would have known what this young man was facing when he came back, and they would have known the reason that the father ran to his son. You see, I would have run to my son, and I would have been happy, and I would have run out of love for him, right? But I probably wouldn't be motivated by love and compassion. I'd feel a little bit of contempt. Son, you got some splaining to do, right? Son, you have no idea what you've put me and your mother through, right? Maybe if you've had a prodigal son or daughter walk away and come back, there's a part of you that wants to get them to kind of get your pound of flesh in it and kind of figure it out. But love and compassion motivate them, and there's a reason why. You see, our picture of Western understanding and this kind of imagery here is insufficient, because these people would have lived in community. If nothing else than for security reasons, they would have had their homes huddled together around one kind of gated area, kind of keeping them safe. And another thing, they lived in community. It was much more important than just security and house placement. It's not just neighborhood development. Their community was that the elders of the community would rule, and there was a ceremony that a young man who walked away, married outside of his tribe, a young man who walked away in some sort of selfish ambition like this, would have had to go through this ceremony called ketzetza. That's how it's pronounced, but since I can't say it without thinking about it, I'm going to call it keza. And keza is the thing that he would have had to experience, or something he would have had to go through before he was allowed to come back in. And what would happen is the elders of the community would see him coming, and they would gather around, and they would listen to his story, listen to his plea. And they would allow his mom to come in and argue on his behalf. But you know what they wouldn't allow? They wouldn't allow the father to attend the ceremony. because the Father's blessing trumped the judgment of Keza every single time. And so when they would hear his argument and hear his mother's plea and ignore his father, they would listen to it, and then they would throw a clay pot at his feet. And the word Keza or Ketzatza means literally to be cut off. And he was never allowed back in the community again. So it explains why the father ran to his son. Because the father was saying, I've got to get to him before they get to him. I've got to get to my son to give him my blessing before they get to my son to give him judgment. The father ran, not because he was just excited to see him, not just because he was loved, but because he was motivated by compassion for his circumstances and the reality that he would face judgment if he didn't get to his son before the elders of the community did. It explains why he ran to his son. And it explains why he put his robe around his shoulders. It explains why he put a ring on his finger. Slaves had no shoes on, so he put shoes on his feet. He brought him in as a son, his arm of acceptance, his robe of significance, his ring signifying that he was a son, no longer a prodigal, that he was brought back into this unbelievable story filled with gasps and condemnation and rejection. A father, a man of this stature, would never run in this culture. Never run, because he would have to gather his robe up and show his ankles and knees, some of his thighs. He'd have to poke his robe down into his belt and be able to run to his son. But he was ready to experience shame to keep his son from experiencing Keza. And that's really what the whole story of Easter is about. When God stands for us when we're falling. When Jesus loved you enough to take shame on himself so that you don't have to experience rejection. Because can I just say this? Despite what our culture says, Scripture says that it is appointed to man once to die, and then the judgment. But here's the most important part of this whole idea, is that before you were ever even willing to step toward Jesus, he was already on the move. Before they got to the tomb, he was already risen. Before the son returned home, the dad was already at work. Look what it says. His father said to the servants, "Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and a sandal for his feet, and kill the calf that we have been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast." Now, let me just stop here for 1 second. Kill the calf that we've been fattening. Now, if you're like me and you get your food from Kroger, right? I get my meat from Kroger, I take it home, put it on the grill a little bit. Like, this means very little to us. But if you're a farmer and you've got some cattle, then you know exactly what's going on. Fattening of a calf is not something that just happens, right? You fatten a calf for a purpose. You have an intended purpose, or you don't start the process of fattening the calf. They fatten the calf for a reason and a purpose. You see what's going on? The father had preparing a party, a feast, long before the son came home. He'd been fattening the calf for the purpose of his son coming home long before the moment when he saw him when he was a long way off. Because he knew that one day his son would return, and that he would run and do whatever it took to meet his son and take shame on himself, to give him acceptance, take shame to keep him from experiencing condemnation. And he'd been preparing the feast, and he brought it all together, and he said, "Get all this stuff together." And then I love this stuff at the end. For the son was mine, was dead, and he's now returned to life. He was lost, but now he's found. Favorite phrase. So the party began. You ever wonder why we make such a big deal out of Easter? Like, why all of a sudden it's a big deal to show up, why it's all of a sudden a big deal to get excited about it. Why is it a huge party around here? Why do we have to have extra services? Here's why. Because there's a party when you come back. Now, maybe you're here today and you're going, "Man, I'm not sure about this whole Jesus thing. Maybe I'm not sure about God, faith, church, religion, all that stuff." And I get it. Christians have done a lot to make it really difficult for people to believe. Can I be honest with you? And here's what I would love for you to understand, is that before you made the first move, God was already on the move. Before you realized that life without Jesus wasn't working, God was already at work in your story. The reason that you're here today isn't because some friend asked you. It's not because it's Christmas or Easter and you go on